Hello and welcome. Welcome to Alta Live, everyone. As our Alta Live attendees fill into this Zoom webinar, it is my great joy to welcome you. I'm going to do a little housekeeping as we begin. So thank you all for joining us today at Alta Live. This is an interview series we do here at Alta Journal, and I'm going to give you a spiel in a second. My name is Beth Spotswood. I'm Alta's digital editor, and today I am so excited to welcome Geoff Manaugh and Nicola Twilley, authors of Until Proven Safe: The History and Future of Quarantine. Extraordinarily, this pair began work on the book before our humanity was even thrust into the current COVID-19 pandemic. So this is an amazing opportunity, and I am excited to hear what they have to say, as I'm sure you are. Nikki and Geoff will be in conversation with Alta Books editor David L. Ulin. Before we begin, if you are unfamiliar with Alta Journal, we are an award-winning quarterly magazine and website focused on California and the West. If you like what we do here today, I so hope you will check us out. We send a free weekly Thursday email. Please consider subscribing. I'm going to toss the link to that in the comments. Speaking of the comments, there is a comment section you are welcome to use. I love when people tell us where they're tuning in from to begin with. I'm up here in Nevada. I know that Nikki, Geoff, and David are all in LA. Please use the comment section or the Q&A button to have ask any questions for Nikki or Geoff that you have. We will spend the last 5 minutes of this discussion getting to your questions. So this conversation today is being recorded. I'm going to send, if you've got to leave early, don't worry. I'm going to send everyone a link to buy the book, to read Alta's review of it, and to rewatch the video or share it with everyone you know. So without further ado, I'm going to get lost and turn this over to the wonderful David L. Ulin.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Nicola and Geoff, for being here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation as well. I admire this book a lot and your work a lot. And I thought, since we have a limited time, I figured we'll just jump right in. As Beth suggested, the origins of this project predate COVID or anything, even thinking about COVID. In fact, I want to talk a little bit about this. When you first started thinking about quarantine, you were thinking about it as something that was pretty much not useful any longer, or something that was a kind of historical situation rather than a current events thing. I'm wondering if we can just start with the general, the origin of the project. It goes back about 12 years, right, to 2009.
It does. I think the idea for looking into quarantine and treating it as a research project came from just kind of a brief, otherwise sort of passing experience, which was that we were in Sydney, Australia, and we went out for a picnic with some local friends, and it was on a spit of land, a peninsula kind of across the bay from Sydney proper. And it used to be a quarantine station. It had now been turned into a thing called Q Station. So it was a spa hotel. And it was interesting that the very sort of isolation that made it such an effective quarantine station back in the day is now what makes it a very effective spa hotel. You can get away from everything. It's got verandas. It was on a, it's got a lot of fresh air and breezes. It's near the coast. All the things that make it good for quarantine, are now the creature comforts. But so the question originally was really, interesting, what happened to quarantine? Why do we no longer quarantine people there? Why do we no longer need this station? Where did quarantine go, or what happened to it? Why did it become obsolete? And of course, when you start looking into quarantine, as we did at that point, you begin to see quite rapidly, actually, that it's not that it became, it's not a historically forgotten process. It's something that, in fact, if anything, so thoroughly shaped the world we live in that it's now kind of everywhere, hiding in plain sight. And that was really what kind of led, I think, to a lot of the research that later became the book.
But I will say it was temporarily sort of pushed into the background because there has been a sort of temporary pause in humanity's sort of being attacked by infectious diseases. For a while, it seemed, with the dawn of antibiotics and sort of the 20th century advances in medicine, that we had these sorts of old diseases that used to wipe out populations. We had them cracked, and TB was curable, and typhus and typhoid and all of these things. Even antibiotics treat the plague, the Black Death. And so it for a while it fell out of favor. And even when we were researching this book, we went to the World Health Organization and they said, look, we don't actually recommend quarantine anymore. It's a medieval tool and, necessary in certain situations, but, too much collateral damage with it. And so for a while that was not a universal public health view, but for a while it did seem as though maybe the era of quarantine had passed.
I want to go back to this idea of it hiding in plain sight. I mean, partly that has to do with the spa you were at in Sydney, but it has more to do than just simply with kind of residual lazarettos, is the word for the quarantine station or quarantine hospital. What are the kind of other ways that, in terms of shaping our culture, or as you say, hiding in plain sight, that quarantine has kind of lingered with us, even if we weren't quite aware of it?
Yeah, that has been a sort of fascinating process teasing it out. I mean, for one thing, quarantine has ended up shaping most of the ways in which we move around the world and the bureaucracies and mechanisms that we do that. So the passport itself is a descendant of the very first health passports, which were pieces of paper you could get in the 1500s if you were wanting to travel around, say, between, Genoa and Bologna, and you wanted to tell the officials, you wanted to skip quarantine basically and not have to do it. Your health passport would say, hey, I'm coming from a safe place. There's not currently an outbreak of the plague here. I am John, 28, with brown hair. They didn't have a passport photo in those days. And let me through. They don't stick me in quarantine. And those health passports that shaped people's free movement have become the passports that we see today. Similarly, there are literal international borders that are former quarantine lines, and we trace some of those in the book. And even up to the level of the sort of the institutions that shape our world, the very first sort of international treaties and gathering of groups of countries to figure out, to start working together, what eventually led to the League of Nations and then the United Nations, were sanitary conferences to deal with how are we going to stop diseases moving around the world. So you can trace the United Nations all the way back to quarantine policy too.
Yeah, and I think just briefly too, I think in that the other thing that is so interesting about quarantine is that because it's briefly, quarantine is different from isolation because quarantine requires uncertainty. So if you don't know that you're infected or you don't know that someone near you is infected, that's when quarantine is appropriate. You're giving someone or something the space and time to reveal something inside of them. And you can tell, I think, instantly that lends itself to all kinds of really interesting metaphoric or narrative or literary potentials. And so the other way I think that quarantine has kind of shaped the modern world is that it's also present in our myths, it's present in our folk tales, it's present in our literature. You can find it in horror fiction, going back to Edgar Allan Poe. You can find it in geographical metaphors and myths. One example we use in the book that I thought was fascinating is the story of Alexander's Gate. It was a myth that was actually so common at one point that it was featured as a real geographic feature on maps of the world at the time. But it was a folktale that Alexander the Great, when he was conquering Central Asia, had his soldiers weld together huge iron gates in the Caucasus Mountains as a kind of barrier between the civilized West and a kind of monstrous seething East. And these gates that were in the middle of the Caucasus, the definition of the Caucasian people, became this way of defining what made the West different from the rest of the world. And I think that, those kinds of metaphors of quarantine and isolation and so on, can be found in some of the oldest stories that we tell each other as humans, and is also just something else that, was immediately clear when we began researching quarantine.
I want to touch on this difference between quarantine and isolation, because especially in the last year and a half, and perhaps in the kind of, the media-driven West, the line between those two things has been blurred. So isolation, as you explain in the book, is what happens once you are sick, right? You are isolated from those who aren't sick, so that contagion doesn't spread. Quarantine is, as you say, a much more liminal kind of state. And so I wonder, this isn't exactly in the book, but I wonder what your sense, having basically spent the last year and a half in some form of quarantine or another, all of us in our own personal lazarettos. What about that? For me, one of the really interesting things about quarantine was its sense of abiding present tenseness in some way. it made me really be aware of where I was in time and space in ways that I often kind of take for granted. And I'm curious both about both of your personal experience and also how this changed or pushed some of your thinking about the subject, and especially in terms of the finishing of the book, the work you did once COVID had emerged.
It's such a good question. Yeah. So quarantine, as you say, it's although they're often used interchangeably, it is different. And the idea is that quarantine is defined by uncertainty, and also by suspicion. So there's a sort of an inherent kind of fear and suspicion built into it. You might be dangerous, or this person might be dangerous, and I have reason to believe that. And so once you do that, and the other thing about it is quarantine is sort of relatively unique in Anglo-Saxon law in that you're sort of guilty until proven innocent rather than vice versa, dangerous until proven safe. And so it's this very powerful thing. And as you say, there's this element of presentness, I think, that comes from the sense that sense of uncertainty. You're waiting for something to resolve itself, and that makes you very aware. It's very frustrating for people because you're waiting, that anticipation to see, am I safe or am I not, is sort of the overriding thing that forces you to live in that present moment of uncertainty. Quarantine is by definition finite. At some point, you will be released. The question is when. And so, yeah, I think this year, seeing that frustration, the other thing that's so fascinating about it is sort of the element of fear. You start questioning yourself. If you were the one quarantined, and this is something we saw in history, Europeans, when sort of the era of travel started and suddenly there were railways and steamships, Europeans found themselves having to quarantine when they re-entered Europe. And they were so used to thinking of themselves as the clean, civilized ones, not the bearers of disease and danger, that when they were put in quarantine, it was this major challenge to their identity. Like suddenly they were the ones who might be revealed to be dirty and diseased. So there is that element too, where you're questioning yourself.
And I think also just one of the things that came out in the experience of the last year for I think many people was the realization of quarantine, not just as an abstract medical tool, but as a lived everyday experience. It was something that we actually had to go through. You can't just say go quarantine and then 3 days later it's over. But I think that one thing that came out a lot was also just how interesting that our own everyday lives, things that we would normally get pleasure from, watching Netflix, just sort of sitting around the house reading books, puttering around the garden, whatever it might be. Those same activities became absolutely intolerable when it was forced and it was something you had to do again and again, and you were sort of trapped in a Truman Show-like way. I think that says something interesting and also speaks to some of the evidence where, a lot of people, even we know, went through major life changes in the last year and a half, either, a divorce or the end of a relationship, or they moved out of the city, they moved to a foreign country entirely. I think people suddenly saw their own everyday life from a totally different perspective. Kind of realized it was an intolerable experience that they wanted to get away from and pursued that elsewhere. Briefly too, we interviewed a boredom researcher in the book who had actually been looking at what happens to people in states of extreme boredom. And one of the things that was interesting about her work was that she did something that she called the jerk study. And it was basically forcing people to watch an unchanging video of a rock for 20 minutes. And at some point, because they were so bored watching this video, I think it was 20 minutes, maybe it was longer, but they were given the option to simply do mean things to other people, including take their money for no reason. And almost everybody decided to do the mean thing because it was just something that you could do when you're in a state of extreme boredom or your life no longer has significance for you. So that was also interesting from a moral point of view. Like there is actual ethical and moral hazard in quarantine, and that you're asking people to give up sources of meaning and then find something else to do. And I feel like that's something that I think is so important moving forward, that we get quarantine right next time as a lived experience.
So how do we get quarantine right? I'm curious, again, having now started the book or started your work on the book with the notion of quarantine as a kind of, let's say, intellectual territory. I hesitate to call it an abstraction exactly, but a historical thing. And then moving through the lived experience of quarantine, both for yourselves individually and collectively for the culture. How do we get quarantine right? I don't know if you saw the the horrifying video of that school board meeting in Tennessee last night, that makes me wonder if we're ever going to be able to get anything right ever again. But what could we do? What did we do wrong? And what could we do more effectively?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons, I would say that I'm most excited for people to read our book, because as it turns out, we have been making the same mistakes for centuries at this point when it comes to quarantine. And our hope is that by gathering all those mistakes together, we could perhaps learn from them and not make them going forward. I think, as you say, this is not actually going to be the only quarantine of our lifetimes. Unfortunately, we are entering a new era of pandemics and infectious diseases. And so it behooves us to learn not only from this experience, but from history and get it right. And it's interesting that you use the word abstraction. That was actually how we found even public health planners who were convinced of the importance of quarantine thought of it as an abstraction. They thought of it as a medical tool. So they would, we went to a lot of simulations where people kind of gamed out what to do in a pandemic before in the years prior to COVID. And oftentimes, officials would say, great, well, we're going to quarantine now. And then they would move on to the next, aspect of the simulation. What are we doing about this? What are we sending aid overseas? What are we doing, et cetera? How's vaccine production looking?
With no active simulation of quarantine, just simply a statement like we're going to quarantine now and we move to the next subject.
Exactly. Like there was just quarantine. It was assumed to work and, flatten the curve, but no consideration of where quarantine would take place, how people would be supported in quarantine financially, their families, but also emotionally and experientially. And that part isn't designed. So that's what we kind of have a little mini manifesto at the end of our book to talk about. And Geoff, do you want to jump in with some of the things?
Sure. I mean, I do think there are a lot of things that would make quarantine more palatable to people in the future. I mean, one, and I'm saying this to start with, simply because my own background is writing about architecture and design and urbanism. There are things we can do better on an architectural and infrastructural point of view, because we open the book actually with this insane scene from more than a year ago, where Seattle or Washington State health authorities purchased an Econo Lodge, and then while the sign was still on, sent a crew out to just paint the sign black. And it was like the opening scene of a horror movie, or just something has gone very wrong with society. So as the black paint, covered the light of the inn, it signified this is now a quarantine facility. But my point there is that we can get ready infrastructurally for the coming quarantine, the next one. We can have a better way of dealing with our convention centers, our hotels, our dormitories, our private homes. We interview the former head of the Army Corps of Engineers, who had a plan for this kind of thing, for retrofitting, large infrastructural or architectural structures and turning them into something that would be useful in a medical sort of frontline response. But I think towards the end of the book, what we really want to focus on, and do focus on rather, is the sense of kind of reframing quarantine as an act of responsibility and as an act of engaging as a member of a public. Reminding us that it isn't just saying, stay at home and do nothing. It's saying participate in a society-wide medical response to a real threat. Do your part, and also recognize the fact that we can't have a public health without a sense of there being a public. These aren't just restrictions for the sake of totalitarian impositions. They're there to make sure that we can outsource our immune systems in a sense, and actually deal with diseases that we can't fight off on our own. So COVID-19, I think, threw a lot of people for a loop because it actually ironically wasn't fatal enough. So I think that there's people who just say, oh, it's just the flu, you'll get over it in 3 days. But it's so that I think is an alarming way of looking at how people will respond in the future. The next disease it'll truly have to be Black Death levels of casualties to get people to respond. But anyway, there's so many different things. I mean, we also talked to people, including the head of quarantine at the CDC, just about the reforms necessary to make sure that the state takes steps in our direction when they ask us to quarantine.
Like a bill of rights for the quarantine. The
Mhm.
idea being that if you are making sacrifices for the public good, then the public owes you a duty of care, including making sure that you can pay your bills, that you have somewhere to stay, that your family's being fed, the kinds of things that need to happen. But I think it sounds trite, but this idea of a rebrand for quarantine, one of the things that our boredom researcher told us is, listen, quarantine, boredom is just a sign that you're not finding what you're doing meaningful. Well, there could be nothing more meaningful than quarantine. You're making this tremendous sacrifice for the public good. It is part of, as Geoff said, it's our, as social animals, it's part of our collective immune system. And you're doing something important. It just doesn't feel that way. Well, we have creative people who can design experiences that make people feel all kinds of ways. Quarantine needs some design help. It needs to be thought through on that level as something that makes sense and makes people feel good. So it's not just the logistics of it, it's the branding of it. It's something, the why and the experience of it need to be much clearer to people. Otherwise, it just simply feels like, well, I'm having my individual liberty restricted, and that's no fair.
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing that struck me at the beginning and all throughout, that it was, the paradox was that the best, most effective way to kind of be a communitarian was to withdraw from the community. And I think that just even that message was never quite branded in the right way. I'm really happy you brought up the whole question of the public and public health. I've been quoting that line since I read this book, like incessantly. We can't have public health without a public. It's so obvious, and yet I'd never quite thought of it that way until I read it in the book. And so I guess I do want to ask about that in terms of how do we, I don't even want to say teach, how do we encourage that kind of sense of, I mean, we at one point theoretically took it for granted. You hear all of the stories about rationing during the war and, oleo and not having leather, rubber, whatever. But now we seem to live in a society that has become so atomized that even the basic notion of a shared public square or commons is beyond us as a collective. And I'm curious about your thoughts, both on that question of how, is the notion of a public still possible, and how do we sort of encourage it so that we're more ready, perhaps, because I agree with you, I don't think this is the last pandemic we're going to be living through.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I feel as though these are larger questions in some ways. I mean, the idea of us living in information bubbles and social media having sort of contributed to this atomization goes far beyond simply reforming quarantine. But I think, there is an aspect of quarantine that makes it really difficult to communicate around. And I do feel as though experts and public health officials need to learn how to do that better, because fundamentally it's all about uncertainty. Quarantine is uncertainty. And that's why it's so important at the start of a disease and when mutations are happening, and we don't know exactly what's going on. But one of the things that's hardest to communicate is uncertainty. And you hear about all this mistrust of scientific experts, and they were wrong. Well, science is a process of chipping away at uncertainty, but unfortunately, it often gets communicated as these are facts, we are experts, and we know better. And so I think this is not perhaps my best formulated thought, but there is something there about communicating uncertainty in a way that isn't that is trust inspiring. That doesn't make people feel like, wow, these people have no idea, but that builds trust around the idea that uncertainty is a perfectly reasonable response to a new disease. Here are the tools we're gonna use. Here's why we think they're gonna work, and here's why we're gonna have to change them as we go down the line and achieve more certainty.
Yeah, I think also it's interesting that, even in the history of quarantine, we saw different communal responses to it. Interestingly, in the origins of quarantine, way back in the 1300s, in the Adriatic Sea region, Dubrovnik, Venice, and other cities of the Venetian Republic, quarantine was actually, ironically, a collective experience. You went to the lazaretto, you went to an external facility as a group, as a family, as the crew of a ship, as an entire neighborhood. And so as a church group, et cetera, you would be put into quarantine and then kind of move through it in a communal experience. So it felt like you were going through something. It was still boring. Even 600 years ago, there were letters to people saying just how little there was to do. But nevertheless, there was a sense that, okay, we're in this together and we're moving through and we're gonna get out of this eventually. So I think it's interesting that, back, as Angelinos, David, Nikki and I, Nikki and I got asked a lot of questions about how, in Los Angeles, is it even better for quarantine in the sense that people already live such atomized lifestyles. Right. But I think that what's ironic in the modern West, at least in the United States, and I mean the West in the very global sense, is that atomized lifestyles kind of made us less prepared for the rigors of being alone all the time, in the sense, again, that it required it in a way that we previously hadn't been subject to in the past. And so in any case, my point is that I think we can learn some things even from the long history of quarantine about communities, community level quarantine, how to feel as if we're going through something as a group, not just as individuals who have been maybe siphoned off in an alarming way. And there are many, many aspects of that I think are going to be important to keep discussing before the next pandemic.
Quarantine was a way for a city to show that it was making its citizens safe, that it was doing something. It was a way to kind of promote confidence. And it doesn't feel like that anymore because it is happening in this distributed sort of invisible way. And so, yeah, it's an interesting question that, not everyone wants to go into vast communal facilities the way that they did in China, but how do you make individual quarantine feel like a communal experience? That should be possible.
Yeah, less ad hoc and more kind of, more collective, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, that seems like a perfect place for us to go to questions from the audience. So Beth, can I bring you back?
Hi.
Hey.
Hello.
Beth is back. Fully vaccinated Beth is back. Question from Jessica. How did you get the idea to talk to a boredom researcher? And who are some of the other unexpected characters or people with unusual professions that you ended up speaking with?
Well, yeah, the boredom researcher came up because we were trying to think about who might have some insight into how to make this experience a designed experience as a lived reality, and who might be able to shed some light on exactly how to make quarantine feel better when you're living through it. So Erin Westgate was her name, and there it's a small but growing field of boredom researchers out there, boredom studies. You can imagine subscribing to the Journal of Boredom Studies. That'll get you through quarantine, right? But yeah, we did meet some terrific people. I mean, my favorite person that we met 3 of these people, but NASA has a position called Planetary Protection Officer, and that person is in charge of protecting all the planets all the time, is the tagline. So we met the woman who used to be the Planetary Protection Officer, we met her successor, and we met the European Space Agency has their own Planetary Protection Officer too. So we met them all, and this is an aspect of quarantine that people might not have thought of, but we have to quarantine other planets from Earth life, and we have to quarantine Earth from life elsewhere in the universe. And it comes directly actually out of, an understanding of what happened the last time 2 biospheres collided, which is when Europeans arrived in the Americas ready to colonize, but bringing all their microbes with them and wiping out enormous, more people were killed by the diseases than by the colonists themselves. And that actually inspired the concept of, hey, let's not do the same elsewhere in the solar system if there is life. So that's a whole chapter in the book that we go into, and a person we met, which is fascinating.
I really hope they were wearing a cape. That is a job.
They had a little badge then.
I had a little badge, double.
Oh, really? More questions popping in here. Hang tight. So how does it work kind of co-authoring a book, nonfiction or otherwise? It sounds hard. Do you each take a chapter or a subject? How do you handle interviews? How do you not get sick of one another?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, we should add that we are married as well. So we just experienced we just had our 19th wedding anniversary. So
Congratulations.
it shows that I guess you can still write books together after a very long marriage. You can always try new things. But yeah, it wasn't always easy. But we eventually did figure out how to make it happen technically. And yeah, we split up the book into different chapters so that we would each take a first pass at different chapters. But then we constantly kind of cycled them back and forth. We added chunks of our own, et cetera, so that, you know, what we wanted to avoid was the feeling that you could pick up, say, chapter 4 and you could guess which one of us wrote it. You know, we wanted to make it feel that it was a sufficiently marbled book. And I think we pulled it off in that sense. But yeah, it was, and then interviews and stuff too, I think was, you know, we would each find experts. Nikki found the boredom expert. You know, we would bring different things to the table and set up interviews, and maybe one of us would be a little bit more quiet in certain interviews, just taking notes while the other person led it, you know, kind of like good cop, bad cop kind of thing. But although I guess we're both good cops.
I was gonna say, who's the bad cop among you?
Me. Yeah.
Yvonne asks, and she apologizes if this is a far out question. I don't think it is at all. With so many people claiming infringement upon their rights, did you explore the Constitution and the amendments to confirm that the public good supersedes the individual in this realm of public health?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. We have a chapter on sort of the legal implications of quarantine, and mostly they're devolved to the state level and local level. And so that's why you get such a sort of patchwork of responses across the US, because those powers exist at the federal level, but are very rarely exercised at that level. But I think I mean, quarantine is something that legal scholars love to debate, because it is, as I said, one of these few cases where you're essentially guilty until proven innocent. But there is a lot of case law around it, and a lot of you know, very clear public health mandates. So yes, the individuals who are, you know, convinced that it's not possible under US law are sadly misguided.
It was also interesting, though, that not just in addition to everything that Nikki said, also the enforcing of health law is also a totally fascinating and underthought through realm of this as well. By sort of the sheer magic of coincidence that comes when you're working on a long-term research project. In the summer of 2019, of all things, there was a convention at the new quarantine facility that was then under construction in Omaha, Nebraska. And it was specifically for the head judges of all 50 states to come to Omaha and talk about quarantine. And so the whole idea was, let's look at quarantine as a power and then how we'll enforce it. There's about 1,000 things we could say there, but one interesting takeaway was an individual who was there, and I'll mention this because this is a book event. So if you're fans of Franz Kafka, it was just like straight out of a Kafka novel. The person was describing how, you know, when you actually look at quarantine powers, oftentimes it's the sheriff's department who is legally required to enforce it. But when you actually speak to the individual sheriffs, a lot of them are like, this is the last thing I'm going to do, and I'm not going to enforce the quarantine rule, either because it's a libertarian thing, or because I just simply don't want to expose myself or risk my family. Other levels of the judicial apparatus don't even know that these powers reside within their field. They think it resides somewhere else. One of the other people who spoke there was the head judge for the state of Maine, who got entangled in a case with a returning nurse named Casey Hickox, and we tell the story of this in the book. But when he was confronted, literally driving to work, he got a phone call saying, "We have to quarantine somebody. What do we do?" You know, he successfully managed to get a 24-hour hold, and then just went home and just read through Maine case law for 24 hours, trying to figure out where in the world quarantine powers resided.
He couldn't even figure out who had the burden of proof in this situation. Yeah. So, I mean, it goes to show this is a tangled. It's all very well to having the powers, but if your judicial authorities are not up to date on what the powers are, if your enforcement is not on board with how they are supposed to, you know, behave, they're as good as not there. So.
We're going a little over. I hope that's okay, but we're getting a ton of questions. I'm going to try and combine some of them. several people kind of mentioned how politicized it's gotten. And I think that there's a component here about, do you think the fact that society is all about instant knowledge, instant needs being met, instant everything, contributes to the problems that we faced in this quarantine, namely the internet, social media, convenience culture? If that didn't exist, if we weren't all bombarded by information instantly, regardless of source, would quarantine have been easier? This current quarantine?
I mean, I think that, do you mind if I jump in?
No.
I do think that sense was and remains a problem in terms of how people look at quarantine now. But I think it goes back to what Nikki was saying earlier, even about the fact that uncertainty is just presented as a de facto evidence that you don't know what you're talking about. So if you say, hey, we don't know how this disease is transmitted, so please do X, Y, or Z. Please stay at home. We don't know what, how to necessarily deal with this germ. Is taken to mean, what do you're medical authorities, what do you mean you don't know? But so one thing I would actually point out, which I think is quite interesting, is that the very idea of quarantine, when it was invented in the late 1300s, it came about in a period of time where we didn't have a germ theory of disease. There was no sense of how not Ebola, how the Black Death, the bubonic plague, was transmitted from one person to the next. They didn't know it was fleas. They didn't know, what the vectors were. And so what's interesting is that other competing disease models said that maybe it's malevolent influence from the stars. It's a spiritual disease. It's something that God wants you to have. It's something that is being inflicted on us for religious reasons. So quarantine doesn't even make sense if you have that narrative that explains it. If we're all being affected by the stars, it makes no sense for me to be in a separate room from you. So quarantine, ironically, by saying, hey, we don't know what's causing this, but let's insert a little bit of time before that ship arrives. We're going to keep that ship out there in the bay, or we're going to keep its crew on an island, and we're going to wait. That period of waiting, which is very uncertain, they didn't even know what they were doing, and they didn't know why it worked, nevertheless seemed to delay the arrival of these diseases. And that's where it really took off as a medical practice, despite the fact that it was a gesture of uncertainty. But so my long-winded point here is that it was actually a very comparatively scientific, rational, and modern approach to disease control. It was saying, let's try this and see what happens. So it seems ironic to me that now 600 years later, that exact approach now, ironically, it feels medieval and superstitious and like a declaration that we don't know what we're doing, but it's the exact same process. It's simply saying, let's wait. Let's hold something at bay. Let's create a buffer between us and it, and see what the effects might be. And so my point there is that it's not just instant knowledge, but I also think it's just the very idea of a lack of knowledge that I think just sends people for a loop and means that they won't trust the experts. They'll come up with their own from the hip medical guidance. And we see conspiracy theories and all kinds of things now flourishing because of that.
Certainly. Is that where the phrase keeping things at bay comes from, I wonder?
I don't think it specifically comes from quarantine, but I do think it means keeping things at bay.
Those of us in the Bay Area cannot help but remember the cruise ship in the Bay.
Oh yeah, of course.
Two more questions and then we're going to wrap it up. Lisa asks, did you cover the importance of walking and or slow streets? And I kind of want to segue that into mental health, how this is impacted, and separate from boredom. Boredom is survivable. Loneliness, for someone like me, I'm an extrovert. I had a really tough time, remarkably tough time. And I know that is a widespread issue with the quarantine. Did you cover kind of mental health and solutions around that in this book, or have anything to chime in about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the funny things about this book is prior to COVID-19, we actually spent quite a long time trying to find someone who had experienced quarantine to interview. So now I could just ask anyone, but it was this major achievement. We felt like prior to COVID-19 when we found a doctor who had an exposure to an Ebola infected patient and was put in quarantine to see whether he developed Ebola or not. And we interviewed him. We were like, yes, we found someone who could tell us what quarantine is really like. And it was interesting, his mental health experience. In some ways he said he's an introvert and he felt really well set up to handle quarantine. He read, he exercised, it was great. But he did say that he had been volunteering in the Congo as a doctor, and he spoke to his children's Congolese nanny, and asked her how she imagined this experience, and she said she could never do it. Never. To be apart from friends and family was impossible for her. And so I think it speaks to first of all, quarantine can't be a one size fits all. There are different cultural norms and different individual norms around what is bearable. And it speaks to the idea that we haven't done enough to think about how to connect people, how to be together while you're alone. People started doing incredibly creative things during these lockdowns to try to connect. I mean, there was, you could swap windows on your screen with someone else in quarantine and start a chat with them, like you could, like windows, I mean, your literal view, and talk about it. People started building ways to connect with people going through the same experience, but that is a really underthought through moment right now. And even in quarantines historically, as Geoff said, they're often much more communal experiences, and had spaces designed to allow you to talk at a distance with visitors, these parlatorios they would be called. And so that aspect of quarantine is often being designed in, and it really wasn't in this era. I think it was felt like people could just connect on technology, so why worry? But clearly that's not enough. So it's another design challenge.
Last question for everyone, including David. How, this is from me. How in all of the, we did an Alta newsletter last week on the trend of people adopting backyard chickens during the pandemic. There are a number of things we did. I started binge watching Ted Lasso on Apple Plus TV. What can you reveal? What is the guilty pleasure, slightly embarrassing quarantine survival tactic that all three of you are willing to reveal right now?
David, you should go first.
David, Ulin.
I'll go first. What got me through, I should also say, I'm not exactly an introvert, but I like being home alone. And I actually, I was perfectly content to be locked down for a long period of time. But my secret was I walked for an hour plus every morning, and I shut down the computer at 6 o'clock so I didn't let my work day drag into the evening. And I played guitar, which I had not played in about 15 years, but had played as a younger person for about an hour every night. And those two things, like the walking at the beginning and the music at the end of the day, really kind of put a frame on the day and gave me a kind of sense of structure.
I mean, for us, we finished a book, and that will that will take a lot of your time. And I also highly recommend being on deadline during lockdown, because you have no FOMO. No one else is doing anything fun that you're missing out on. So you may as well sit at your computer and bang out some more words. But that's not really a guilty pleasure. I guess the guilty pleasure was we probably just ordered too much good wine. There's a California-based winemaker that we really like, Field Recordings, and embarrassingly, they sent us a little note at the end of year because we were like one of their top customers. Had no intention of ordering that much.
I love that. Yeah. Geoff, anything else to add? Did you watch all of The Real Housewives?
Well, I think I fell head over heels in love with mourning doves. Actually, we had a mourning dove couple that nested outside our kitchen window. And now I feed so many mourning doves. So many mourning doves come in to eat the seed that we buy that I'm worried that we're going to get reported for like a neighborhood nuisance feeding station. But anyways, yeah, I'm obsessed with mourning doves and other very ordinary California birds like California towhees and sparrows and whatnot. Very briefly, I'll say too, there's actually a chicken anecdote in the book. It turns out, in fact, that California and other states have and Los Angeles specifically has a flock of sentinel chickens. The idea is that these chickens are kept out there to see if they get West Nile virus. And if they do get West Nile virus, then they're used as a biological kind of like early warning line for saying that we've got a new possible infection coming into the city. But it turns out there's sentinel chickens and sentinel plots, which are just open stretches of land used to see if the invasive species might or agricultural diseases might take root there. And so for all of you and then also it turns out that, another place that we went to, a biological research station, wouldn't let people own chickens at home because it was seen as a risk that if they contracted one of these very serious diseases, they might bring it home and give it to a chicken, in which case they've helped do a kind of reverse zoonosis and help mutate a disease. And so anyway, chickens and pandemics and quarantine are actually interestingly connected.
I love that. Linda asks, what did I do? I did the sourdough baking. I started a garden and I watched all of Seinfeld from the beginning until Larry David left at season 7. With that, I want to thank Nikki and Geoff and David. And before everyone leaves, please join us next week. We are going to welcome Priyanka French and Randy Dunn, 2 winemakers who are bracing and sadly already preparing for wildfire season in the Napa Valley. And so we're going to talk with winemakers about how they are managing, preparing, and in some cases preparing to fight fire on their own. And that's August 18th, Wednesday, 12:30, always Alta Live. We're going to send you a link to this interview, to Nikki and Geoff's amazing book, the review in Alta Journal, and anything else we talked about today. So I am so grateful to Nikki and Geoff and for sharing their wisdom and this great book with us. David, of course, my colleague, for moderating, and to all of you for joining us today. Please continue to stay safe, and we will see you next time.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Beth.
Thanks.
Thanks.